The girl who stood alone. The late afternoon sun slanted through the wide windows of Courtroom 3B, drenching the polished wooden floors in gold. The light didn't soften the room's austere formality, but it did catch on the dust swirling in the still air, making everything feel suspended, like the courtroom itself was holding its breath. The creak of the door broke the silence. A hush swept through the gathered spectators. First came Marissa Caldwell, one of the court bailiffs, her sturdy frame blocking half the doorway. Then, a small figure emerged from behind her, a girl who barely reached Marissa's waist. The girl's steps were hesitant, her scuffed sneakers dragging slightly against the polished floor. She wore a too-big lavender hoodie that slipped off one shoulder, exposing the sharp angle of her collarbone. Her thin legs were swallowed by faded jeans, the fabric worn soft and frayed at the cuffs. She clutched the sleeve of her hoodie like it was a lifeline, her knuckles pale against her dark skin. Her name was Kayla James. She was 7 years old, but she could have passed for 5. Life had carved out pieces of her before her bones were even fully formed. She stepped into the room like a rabbit caught in the open, her wide eyes darting from the judge's bench to the towering windows, to the faces staring back at her. Across the room sat Marshall Davenport. His seat at the defense table looked like a throne. His charcoal suit was expensive, tailored to the broad lines of his shoulders. The silk tie nodded with casual arrogance. A faint scent of cologne hovered around him. Woodsy, expensive. His hand-stitched leather shoes rested perfectly parallel on the floor, a man who understood the power of posture. He was a businessman, but today he was also a man under suspicion, a foster parent whose wealth had shielded him from too many questions. Until today, Judge Samuel Ford, whose years on the bench had worn deep grooves into his brow, sat silently watching the girl. His robes pooled over his shoulders, his hands steepled beneath his chin. There was something behind his eyes, something that said he had seen too much to be easily surprised, but too much to ignore a child trembling before him. The bailiff led Kayla to the witness stand. It was far too large for her. She had to climb onto the seat, her sneakers dangling inches off the floor. The microphone stood stiff and unforgiving in front of her. She didn't speak, not yet. Her fingers clutched the wood railing like a drowning girl holding onto driftwood. "Kayla James," the clerk called out, "do you promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Kayla's voice was a whisper, too soft to reach the microphone. Her lips barely moved. "What was that, sweetheart?" Judge Ford asked, his voice gentler than anyone had expected. "I promise," she whispered, though the promise felt too big for her. Marshall Davenport's lawyer, a sleek man named Connor Raines, stood. His suit was a shade lighter than Marshall's, his smile even sharper. "Let's keep this simple," Connor said, his voice as smooth as a polished floor. "Kayla, you've been living with Mr. Davenport for almost a year, correct?" Kayla's eyes flicked to Marshall and immediately down again. Her small fingers curled into the fabric of her hoodie. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "And he's been good to you?" Connor prompted. She said nothing. "Has he fed you? Given you clothes?" Connor's smile widened like he was leading her down a safe path. Kayla's mouth worked, but no words came. Her thin shoulders trembled. Judge Ford leaned forward. "Take your time, Kayla," he said. "You're safe here." Her head shook. Not a no, not a yes. Just fear, trapped and twisting inside her. Connor shifted tactics. "Kayla," he said, his voice just a shade tighter. "Mr. Davenport has provided you a very nice home. You're lucky to have him, aren't you?" She shook her head so hard her braids slapped against her cheeks. "No," she whispered. The room went still. "No," Connor echoed, his smile flickering. "Why not?" Kayla's breathing grew ragged. She twisted the sleeve of her hoodie tighter until the seam pulled apart with a soft rip. "Please," she whispered, so low that only Judge Ford could hear. "Please, don't make me go back." The words were like gunfire in the quiet room. Judge Ford's brow furrowed. His fingers tightened around the edges of his bench. "What did you say, Kayla?" His voice was gentle, coaxing. Her breath hitched. "Please," she said again. "Please don't send me back there." The gallery erupted into murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. Someone gasped audibly. Marshal Davenport's expression never flickered. He sat, hands clasped, mouth set in a patient smile. But there was a flicker in his eyes, something cold and calculating. Connor raised a hand to quiet the room. "Kayla, I know moving homes can be scary." Kayla shook her head. "He hurts me." The words hung in the air like a crack of thunder. Judge Ford's gavel slammed down, the sound ringing off the paneled walls. "Silence," he ordered. But Kayla wasn't done. Tears streamed down her face, her voice cracking like thin ice. "He locks me in the dark. He says no one cares about me. He says nobody's coming." Her small chest heaved with sobs, the kind of tears that come from breaking something that's already broken. Marshal Davenport's smile disappeared. Connor straightened his cuffs, but his composure was thin as paper now. "Your Honor," he began, "this child has a history of behavioral issues." "Enough," Judge Ford said, cutting him off. "We are not dismissing these claims without a full investigation." Connor opened his mouth to object, but the judge's gaze pinned him in place. "Bailiff," Ford said, "seal the doors." Marissa paused, startled. "Your Honor, no one leaves this room until I understand what's happening." His gavel struck again, final and unyielding. "Lock the courtroom." The metallic clang of the locks echoed through the room. Marshall leaned back, unbothered, fingers steepled in thought. "This is a waste of time, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "She's a troubled child. They all are." The judge's eyes narrowed. "Maybe," he said, "but I'll decide that." From the witness stand, Kayla curled in on herself, her small hands trembling in her lap. The oversized hoodie swallowed her whole, but it couldn't hide her fear. Outside, the courthouse fell silent, as though the whole world was waiting for what would happen next. Inside, the truth hovered in the air, heavy as smoke, and for the first time, Kayla wasn't standing alone. The lockdown, the clang of the heavy courtroom doors locking reverberated through the silence, a metallic exclamation point punctuating the air. Conversations died mid-sentence, and the low murmur of voices dissolved into stunned quiet. No one moved. No one dared. Judge Samuel Ford leaned back slightly in his chair, his thick hands folded over his chest, fingers tracing the edge of his robe. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between cold calculation and the kind of simmering anger that only men who've seen too much injustice can hold in their bones. His weathered eyes rested on Marshal Davenport, who sat unnaturally still at the defense table. Davenport didn't react outwardly. His fingers remained loosely clasped in front of him, his gold cufflinks catching the last of the slanted afternoon light. But there was a slight twitch at the corner of his mouth, a hairline fracture in the polished mask. The silence was broken by the faint rustle of papers as Connor Raines, Davenport's high-priced attorney, shuffled through his briefcase with exaggerated casualness. His fingers moved smoothly, but the faint tremor in his left hand betrayed him. "Your Honor," Connor began, keeping his voice smooth and unthreatening. "Surely there's no need for such dramatics. Locking the courtroom is unconventional." Judge Ford's gaze flicked to him, as cold and sharp as a winter wind cutting across bare skin. "Unconventional is what happens when a 7-year-old girl stands in my courtroom and begs not to go home." Connor's mouth opened, but Ford raised a thick hand, silencing him. "No one leaves," the judge said again, his voice low but carrying, filling every inch of the room like a thunderstorm gathering just out of sight. "Not until we find out what's happening to this child." Kayla sat frozen on the witness stand, her thin arms wrapped around herself, her shoulders curled inward like she could make herself vanish into her too large hoodie. Her eyes flicked to the locked doors, then to Marshall, then back to her lap. Her small fingers twisted the hem of her sleeve over and over until the fabric frayed. "Kayla," the judge said, his tone softening when his gaze returned to her. "I want you to know something. You are safe here." The words landed in the room like fragile glass, barely audible over the thudding of Kayla's own heartbeat. Safe. It was a word she barely recognized, a language she couldn't speak. "Would you like a glass of water?" the judge asked. She nodded, so small it was almost imperceptible. Bailiff Marissa Caldwell moved with surprising gentleness, stepping from her post to retrieve a small plastic cup from the table behind her. She handed it to Kayla, who held it with both hands, the water trembling with her grip. She sipped carefully, her parched throat working with each swallow. Marshal Davenport exhaled through his nose, loud enough for the judge to hear. The sound was a deliberate reminder of his patience wearing thin. "Your Honor," Connor tried again, his tone edged with performative concern. "I understand this is difficult, but it's important to remember that children in the foster system often—" The judge's gavel cracked down like a gunshot. "We're not discussing the foster system right now. We're discussing this child." Marshall's fingers tapped once, twice, against the table. "This is absurd," he muttered, just loud enough for the nearest row of spectators to hear. "This girl is lying." Kayla flinched at his words, her grip tightening around the cup, water sloshing dangerously close to the rim. "Mr. Davenport," Judge Ford said, "you will remain silent until asked to speak." The room seemed to tighten around those words. Marshall leaned back, folding his arms across his chest, the gesture more arrogant than defensive. His smirk returned, subtle but unmistakable. "This is just a misunderstanding," he said smoothly, addressing the room rather than the judge. "Kayla's had issues in every placement she's been in. It's not her fault, of course, but she's troubled. She's terrified," Judge Ford corrected, his voice clipped. "And you're more concerned with defending yourself than asking why." The door at the back of the courtroom opened again, and a court clerk hurried in, her arms cradling a thick manila folder. Its edges were worn, corners folded down like a much-handled letter. She placed it carefully on the judge's bench, avoiding the eyes of everyone present as though the weight of the folder was heavier than paper should ever be. "What's that?" Connor asked, already sensing it wasn't going to help his client. "Her foster file," Judge Ford said. "The unredacted version." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Connor's expression tightened just slightly. "With all due respect, Your Honor, that file contains confidential." Judge Ford didn't even look at him. "The only confidentiality I care about right now is the truth." He opened the file. The pages crackled with age, but the ink was clear, the story it told unfolding line by line. Case notes, incident reports, medical evaluations, photographs, bruises on thin arms, fading handprints across ribs, a fractured wrist. Kayla sat still, her chin tucked into her chest, but her eyes never left the folder. She knew what was inside, even if she hadn't seen it herself. "What are you hiding, Mr. Davenport?" Judge Ford's voice cut through the silence like a blade through paper. Marshall's smile didn't falter, but the fingers of his left hand curled inward, nails pressing into his palm. "This is all very dramatic," he said, "but you have no proof." "No proof." Judge Ford's brow arched. He lifted one of the photographs, a close-up of Kayla's back, her skin a patchwork of bruises in various stages of healing. Some old, some new. The gallery erupted in a low murmur, outrage flickering through the crowd like a lit fuse. Marshall's smile faded, the first real crack in his composure. "She falls," Connor said quickly, standing again. "Kids fall all the time." Judge Ford turned the photo so the courtroom could see. "These are belt marks." Kayla's head snapped up, her breath caught in her throat. The silence after the judge's words was so profound it seemed to suck all the air from the room. Marshall said nothing. "You think money can bury this," Judge Ford said quietly. "You think sealed records and paid-off caseworkers will keep you safe." The words hung in the air, heavy with accusation. Kayla spoke then, her voice a whisper, but somehow it filled the room. He said no one would believe me. The judge's throat worked once, twice, before he spoke. I believe you. The gavel slammed down once more, the sound echoing like thunder. This court is officially an emergency session, Judge Ford announced, standing to his full height. All foster care placements under Mr. Marshall Davenport's custody will be suspended, effective immediately. Marshall surged to his feet, his chair skidding back with a scrape. You can't do that. Judge Ford's eyes were sharp as knives. Watch me. The courtroom was no longer a place of law. It was a battlefield, and for the first time in her life, Kayla wasn't fighting alone. The House of Secrets. The thick wooden doors of Courtroom 3B stood sealed, the echo of Judge Ford's last gavel strike still reverberating through the air. The gathered crowd had fallen into a stunned silence, as if the weight of Kayla's trembling voice had seeped into the walls themselves. At the defense table, Marshall Davenport's carefully constructed image was unraveling. His fingers, the same hands that once signed multi-million-dollar contracts with the ease of a man accustomed to always winning, now curled tightly around the edge of the polished oak table. His knuckles had paled, but his face remained a mask of cold, arrogant confidence. Only his eyes betrayed him, quick, darting glances toward the doors, the judge, the court reporter, anyone who might offer a way out. But there was no way out. Not today. Judge Ford stood slowly, the worn leather of his chair creaking under the shift in weight. He rested both palms on the bench, leaning slightly forward, his weathered face hardening like stone. Mr. Davenport, Ford said, each syllable pronounced with measured weight, I suggest you make yourself comfortable, because we're not leaving this room until I understand exactly what's been happening inside your house. The word house hung in the air like a threat. Across the room, Kayla sat motionless, her tiny hands cradling the empty plastic water cup like a fragile relic. The sleeve of her hoodie was torn now, the edge frayed from her anxious twisting. Her small legs swung slightly above the floor, the scuffed soles of her sneakers tapping out an uneven rhythm against the wooden support beam beneath her. The room felt colder, heavier, with the truth fighting its way to the surface. Connor Raines, Marshall's high-priced lawyer, finally stood, his slick confidence fraying at the edges, his smile barely stretched across his face. Your Honor, I think we can all agree that Kayla has been through a lot. His voice was smooth, but there was a tremor at the edges, like a man navigating thin ice. It's entirely possible that she's confused. Children her age often misunderstand discipline. Kayla flinched at the word. Discipline. Judge Ford's gaze sharpened. Discipline doesn't leave pattern bruises, Mr. Raines. Connor opened his mouth, but a sharp knock on the locked doors interrupted him. All heads turned. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. Marissa, the bailiff, exchanged a glance with the judge before unlatching the door. The heavy wood swung open just enough to admit Detective Olivia Marks, her sharp brown eyes scanning the room in one sweep before striding in with purpose. Marks was no stranger to these halls, a seasoned investigator whose no-nonsense presence could cut through legal posturing like a scalpel through silk. Her dark hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her gray blazer was creased from hours spent behind the wheel and in the field. She held a folder thick with documents, but it was the grim set of her mouth that caught Judge Ford's attention. She didn't wait for permission. Judge, she said, her voice low and firm, we need to talk about the Davenport house. Marshall's jaw tightened. For the first time, a flicker of something close to fear crossed his face. Not the fear of guilt, but the fear of exposure. Judge Ford gestured her forward. You've got the floor, Detective. She didn't hesitate. She opened the folder, pulling out photographs, aerial images, floor plans, interior shots. The topmost photo was a picture of a basement door, its surface scarred with deep gouges, the kind left behind by fingernails. Kayla's breath caught audibly at the sight of it, her fingers going rigid around the plastic cup. We executed a preliminary search warrant this morning, Mark said, her tone devoid of embellishment. Based on reports we received from an anonymous source, we were able to access the property while Mr. Davenport was in court. Marshall's lawyer blustered immediately. That's illegal. My client's rights were fully respected, Mark said, cutting him off without so much as a glance in his direction. We were given credible evidence indicating ongoing abuse, which justified the search. She laid out more photos, fanning them across the table like a hand of cards. One photo showed a small bedroom with no windows, the mattress directly on the concrete floor, no blankets, no pillows, just a stained sheet crumpled in one corner. Another showed a locked metal cabinet, its contents partially visible, duct tape, zip ties, a leather belt coiled like a snake. The courtroom held its collective breath. Kayla, Mark said, her voice gentler now, do you recognize this room? Kayla's chin dipped in a tiny nod. Tears pooled in her eyes, blurring her vision, but she didn't look away from the photo. That's where I go, she whispered. Where you go? Judge Ford prompted, voice softer than usual. When I'm bad, she said. He locks me there. The air felt heavier, pressing down on every chest in the room. Connor Rain's face paled. There could be a reasonable explanation. There isn't, Marks said coldly. She reached into her folder again and withdrew 2 thin case files, sliding them onto the judge's bench. These are files from 2 of Davenport's previous foster placements, she said. Both children, a boy named Malik and a girl named Teresa, spent time in that room. Marshall's knuckles whitened on the edge of the table. Judge Ford flipped the files open, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. Both labeled as runaways, he read aloud. No follow-up investigation. Because someone inside Child Protective Services buried it, Mark said. Records were sealed or outright destroyed. These files only exist because of off-the-books copies kept by a former caseworker who disappeared last year. Kayla's breathing grew faster, her small chest rising and falling in panicked bursts. He said they were bad, she said suddenly, voice cracking. He said they ran away because they didn't deserve him. She curled into herself again, the weight of her own memories too heavy to hold upright. Marshall finally spoke, his voice sharp, trying to reclaim control. This is all circumstantial. You can't possibly. Mark slid one last photo onto the table, a close-up of a shoe, partially buried in the dirt just outside the basement's storm door. It belonged to Malik, Mark said. We confirmed it with the original placement records. Connor stumbled over his response, reaching for legal jargon that evaporated before he could form it into words. The evidence was too damning, the pattern too clear. This is a circus, Marshall spat, pushing back from the table. This whole court is against me. No, Judge Ford said quietly. This court is against monsters. Marshall's chair scraped back as he stood, his carefully curated mask collapsing into something feral, the kind of raw anger that comes when a predator realizes the lights have been flipped on. I gave those kids everything, he hissed. Food, clothes, a roof over their heads. And this is the thanks I get. Judge Ford's voice was steel. Sit down. For a moment, Marshall didn't move. His chest heaved, his teeth bared in something that wasn't quite a smile. Then, slowly, he lowered himself back into his seat. Kayla didn't look at him. Her small hands, still clutching the empty cup, were trembling, but not with fear anymore. With the first fragile flicker of something else. Hope. And in the center of the room, under the weight of sunlight streaming through the windows, the house of secrets that Marshall Davenport had built brick by brick began to collapse. Buried beneath the floorboards. The air in Courtroom 3B felt thicker than it should have, like something old and rotten had been stirred up from beneath the floorboards. No one dared speak, even as the faint hum of the overhead lights buzzed in the tense silence. The photos laid out across the judge's bench weren't just evidence. They were a graveyard, silent testimonies of children who had passed through Marshall Davenport's pristine doors and vanished into thin air. Detective Olivia Marks stood at the center of the room, her back straight, her jaw set. Her presence carried weight, the kind that came from years of seeing the worst humanity had to offer and somehow still showing up to fight it. Her fingers rested lightly on the folder that held Kayla's case file, but her eyes were locked on Marshall. "We're not talking about isolated incidents," Marks said, her voice low but cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "We're talking about a pattern, a house built on secrets." At the witness stand, Kayla's tiny frame seemed even smaller, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her nails dug crescent moons into her palms. The courtroom felt too big around her, every sound too loud, every face too sharp. She wasn't supposed to talk about the basement. She wasn't supposed to talk about the others. But they were still down there, even if the house was empty now. The memories didn't come back all at once. They were shards, sharp and glittering, cutting her fingers as she tried to hold them. The smell of damp concrete, the scratch of rough blankets against her skin, the click of the lock, the sound of Teresa's voice, whispering stories to keep the dark away. "Teresa wasn't bad," Kayla said suddenly, her voice so soft it almost disappeared. "She was nice." The courtroom stilled again. "She was older," Kayla added, her gaze still locked on her lap. "She used to sing sometimes, when he put us down there." "Us." Judge Ford's voice was gentle, though his knuckles whitened against the wood of his bench. "There were others." Kayla gave a small nod, so slight it was like the air itself might crush it if she moved too much. "Malik," she said, voice cracking on the name. And Jordan." Judge Ford leaned forward, the name striking something deep in his memory. "Jordan Matthews." Kayla's chin dipped again. "He was there before me. But then, one night," she couldn't finish. Her hands shook too badly, and the words caught somewhere deep in her throat like thorns. The silence stretched unbearably, until Detective Marks stepped forward again, sliding yet another photograph onto the table. This one was faded, edges curling slightly, but the face in the picture was clear. A boy with a wide, toothy smile and a gap where his front tooth should have been. "Jordan Matthews was placed with Marshall Davenport 3 years ago," Marks said. 2 months later, he disappeared. Officially, his case file lists him as a runaway. Marks didn't blink. Unofficially, there's no trace of him ever leaving that house. The walls seemed to press inward, the air turning colder despite the sun blazing through the windows. The quiet murmurs of the spectators had dried up entirely. No one wanted to breathe too loudly. Judge Ford's voice was steel-wrapped in silk. "Mr. Davenport, would you care to explain why 3 children placed in your home disappeared?" Marshall's fingers tapped out an irregular rhythm against the defense table. 1, 2, pause. 3, 4. The nervous tell of a man who realized the noose was tightening. Connor Raines, his lawyer, shot to his feet. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate. There is no actual proof that—" "Sit down, Mr. Raines." Judge Ford's voice could have shattered glass. "We're past the point of deflections." Connor's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his knuckles white against the armrest. Kayla's breathing grew shallow, her chest rising and falling too quickly. The room was too small again, the light too bright. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the memories bled through anyway. Jordan, crying quietly so he wouldn't hear. Teresa, holding her hand under the thin blanket, whispering about what stars might look like if they ever got to see them. The sound of the storm door creaking open. Kayla's whole body jerked. Judge Ford saw it. "Kayla," he said softly, "I know this is hard, but can you tell me what happened to Teresa?" The name alone made her heart race. She tried to leave. The words were barely a whisper. She said if we ran together, we could get to the street. Kayla's fingernails dug into her palm, her shoulders curling inward. "She made it to the door," Kayla said, "but he was waiting. He knew." Her breath stuttered, but she forced herself to keep going. He said nobody was gonna miss her anyway. Connor stood again, his voice louder this time. Your Honor, these are just the fragmented recollections of a traumatized child. She's telling the truth. The voice didn't belong to Kayla. Every head turned toward the back of the courtroom, where a woman stood clutching a battered manila folder against her chest. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair half pulled from its ponytail, but her face was resolute. Angela Perry, former CPS caseworker. The woman's voice shook only slightly. And I've been trying to tell someone this for 3 years. Marshall went stone still. Angela stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Judge Ford's. They paid me to stay quiet, she said. The agency, his lawyers, even some of my own supervisors. They said these kids were troublemakers, that they were lying to get attention. Her hand trembled as she laid the folder on the table. But they weren't lying. The folder fell open, revealing handwritten notes, photographs, and letters, one she'd written to her supervisors, begging for someone to investigate. Letters that had never been filed. Marks flipped through them, her face grim. This is enough to bury him. Marshall finally stood. His usual smooth composure shattered into shards of rage and fear. This is all lies, he spat. Those kids were screw-ups. Runaways. You locked them in a basement, Judge Ford said, his voice like a hammer hitting cold steel. You starved them. You beat them. And when they disappeared, you made sure no one asked questions. Marshall's breath came in short, angry bursts. I gave them a home. You gave them a prison, Ford said, standing to his full height. And you're not going to walk away from it. The gavel slammed down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. Bailiff, Ford said, his voice ringing through the stunned silence. Take Mr. Davenport into custody. Marshall lunged for the door, but Marissa and 2 other officers were faster, pinning him against the table, the clink of handcuffs cutting through the silence. Kayla's eyes stayed locked on her lap. She didn't watch him being dragged out. She didn't have to. For the first time, the monster was gone. But even as the door slammed shut behind him, Kayla's fists stayed clenched, because she knew what the rest of them didn't. There were more monsters out there. And some of them still wore badges. The monsters wearing badges. The heavy slam of the courtroom door echoed long after Marshall Davenport had been dragged out in handcuffs. His protests, once smooth and confident, had dissolved into feral snarls, rage spilling from the cracks in his carefully curated mask. But even with the monster gone, Kayla's small hands stayed curled into trembling fists, her body rigid in the too big witness chair. The space he left behind didn't feel empty. It felt like a hole in the earth, one that reached much further down than anyone here had imagined. Judge Samuel Ford exhaled slowly, the weight of the afternoon settling onto his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He had presided over thousands of cases, but there was something uniquely suffocating about this one. Not just the cruelty, the silence that had allowed it to fester. He looked at Angela Perry, the former CPS worker who had stepped forward moments ago with trembling hands and a folder stuffed with warnings no one had read. Her face was gaunt, her eyes rimmed with the hollows left by guilt and fear, but she stood her ground. Miss Perry, Judge Ford said, his voice gentler than anyone expected. You said you've been trying to come forward for 3 years. She swallowed hard, her eyes flicking once to Kayla, who still hadn't lifted her head. Longer, actually. It started with Malik. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. I saw the bruises during a home visit. I filed my reports, requested emergency removal. A week later, those reports vanished. A low murmur rippled through the gallery. They told me Malik was a liar, she said bitterly. A difficult child making trouble for a good man who was just trying to help. Who's they? Judge Ford's voice was low and dangerous. Angela's fingers curled around the edge of the manila folder like it was the only thing keeping her standing. My supervisor. Her boss. Lawyers hired by Davenport. Even the head of the county placement board. The room shifted under the weight of those words. That was the top. The very people meant to safeguard children like Kayla. Names, Judge Ford said firmly. Angela's jaw clenched. Supervisor Paul Whittaker, Regional Director Gail Nichols. Both signed off on closing Malik's case. Both signed off when Teresa disappeared. And both ignored me when I said Davenport was dangerous. Judge Ford's fingers tapped once against the bench, the rhythm deliberate. Do you have documentation? Angela nodded once and passed him the folder with hands that shook only slightly. Inside, the papers were worn and creased from being handled too many times. Desperation embedded in every smudge. Why now? The judge asked. Why are you coming forward today? Angela's lips trembled into something close to a bitter smile. Because they can't cover for him anymore. The second they locked this courtroom down, I knew this was my only chance to be heard. The judge flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening with every page. Handwritten case notes with portions crossed out by a heavier hand, emails that were cut off mid-thread, official reports with convenient sections mysteriously redacted. It was deliberate. It was organized. It was systemic. This wasn't just negligence, Judge Ford said slowly. This was a coordinated effort to protect him. Angela nodded, her hands clasped in front of her, as if trying to hold herself together. He's valuable, she said quietly. He donates to the mayor's re-election campaigns, hosts fundraisers, sponsors foster programs so he can pick which kids come into his house. Kayla flinched at that, her whole body curling in on itself. Detective Olivia Marks stepped closer, her jaw set. Judge, she said, her voice low but urgent. If Davenport had access to the placement lists. He had a menu. Angela interrupted, her voice raw with disgust. The kids with no family. The ones with behavioral issues. The ones nobody checked on too closely. The words hung in the air like smoke from a slow-burning fire, creeping into every corner of the room. Judge Ford's knuckles turned white against the bench. Bailiff, he said, his voice low and dangerous. I want every child placed in that home accounted for. Now. Marissa, the bailiff, nodded and slipped out the door, her footsteps urgent against the marble floor. The silence left behind was thick enough to choke on. At the witness stand, Kayla's breathing quickened, her small chest rising and falling in shallow bursts. The walls were closing in again. They always did when the truth got too close. Detective Marks knelt beside her, her voice low and steady. Kayla, she said softly, I need to ask you something very important. Are there places in the house? Places nobody ever saw. Kayla's hands gripped the edges of her hoodie, twisting the fabric until her knuckles turned white. She shook her head at first, but then, slowly, she nodded. The basement, she whispered. But there's another place. Marks didn't move. Can you tell me where? Kayla's eyes darted to the side, unfocused. Under the stairs, she said. There's a door, but it looks like a wall. Marks exchanged a sharp glance with the judge. Did anyone else know about it? Kayla swallowed hard. Just him. The room was so quiet they could hear the creak of the courthouse settling around them, the bones of the building shifting under the weight of what had been spoken. Angela's face paled. I never saw a second door. You weren't supposed to, Kayla said, her voice small but certain. He only put you there if you were really bad. The judge's voice was barely above a whisper. Did you ever see what was inside? Kayla's hands stopped twisting her sleeve. There were boxes, she said, big ones, and clothes, but not my size. Her lip trembled. Teresa's sweater was there after she was gone. A hush fell over the courtroom, heavy and impenetrable. Detective Marks stood slowly, her face hardening into professional focus. We need a full search of that house. Every inch. Angela's shoulders sagged with visible relief, but her hands were still shaking. If they knew I was here, she whispered, they'll come after me. They'll try, Marks said grimly. but they'll have to go through me. Judge Ford's gavel struck the bench, not in anger this time, but in finality. This court will not be adjourned, he said. We are officially coordinating with state authorities to launch a full-scale investigation into every placement Marshal Davenport has ever had. Connor Raines stood, his pale face slick with sweat. Your Honor, with all due respect. You have none, Ford said sharply. Sit. Connor sat, deflated. The door opened again, and Marissa returned, her face pale, her phone clutched in one hand. We have a problem, she said quietly. 3 of the children from Davenport's placements can't be located. The silence was deafening. Find them, Ford said. Whatever it takes. Kayla sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. For the first time in her life, someone was looking for the missing kids. And she wasn't the only voice screaming into silence anymore. The walls remember everything. The courtroom was quieter than it had been all day, yet the air felt heavier, like the weight of all the unspoken things pressed against the walls. With Marshal Davenport hauled away in cuffs, the monster was gone. But the house he built still stood, and the secrets it held were buried deeper than any arrest warrant could reach. Kayla sat at the witness stand, her small frame nearly swallowed by her hoodie, her fingers twisting the worn hem until loose threads curled like spiderwebs around her hands. Every pair of eyes in the room was on her, but for the first time, they weren't watching her like a problem to be solved. They were listening to the last child left behind. Detective Olivia Marks stood just feet away, her hands on her hips, her jaw set in that way cops get when they've seen enough to fill a lifetime. But no, there's still more to come. Angela Perry, the caseworker who had risked everything by coming forward, stood further back, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, as though holding herself together was the only thing keeping her standing. But it was Judge Samuel Ford who carried the room now. His fingers curled lightly over the edges of his bench, his weathered hand steady, his expression grave. He had seen corruption before, but never this deliberate, this organized, this cruel. This was rot that started at the roots. Kayla, Judge Ford said softly, his voice warmer than the worn oak beneath his hands. We're going to keep you safe now. Kayla's shoulders twitched, but she didn't lift her head. Safe was a word grown-ups liked to say. Safe meant promises that never lasted. Safe had never meant safe. Her voice was quiet, but it carried through the courtroom, every word cutting like broken glass. They always say that. No one breathed. The silence pressed in again, but this time it didn't feel empty. It felt full. Full of the weight of every foster kid who'd ever sat in a room like this, hands folded in their laps, waiting for strangers to decide their fate. Detective Marks stepped closer, careful not to crowd her. You're right, Kayla, she said, her voice gentler than the steel edge it had carried earlier. They do say that a lot. She crouched, lowering herself so she wasn't standing over the girl, her eyes level with Kayla's. But I'm not going anywhere, Mark said. Not until we find out what happened to Teresa and Malik and Jordan. Not until we find out where they are. Kayla's fingers curled tighter into the fabric of her sleeve. She didn't say it, but it flickered in her wide, dark eyes. You'll leave. They always leave. We found something, Marissa, the bailiff, said from the back of the room. Her face was pale, her usual authority softened by what she'd just heard through her earpiece. The search team at the house. Judge Ford straightened. What did they find? Marissa's throat worked as she swallowed. The door under the stairs. Kayla's whole body tensed, her knuckles turning white. Go on, Ford prompted. The room behind it. It wasn't just a hiding place. Marissa's voice dropped slightly, as though saying it any louder would make it worse. It was a holding cell. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Pallet on the floor, Marissa continued. Chains bolted to the wall. And in the corner, a pile-off. She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Kayla's breath quickened, her chest rising and falling too fast. It's okay, baby, a soft voice said. The doors at the back of the courtroom had opened, and a woman stood there, her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. Her hair, once black, had streaks of silver running through it, and her face was weathered by time and worry. But the moment she saw Kayla, her expression broke into relief so profound it hurt to look at. "Grandma." Kayla's voice was so small, but it cut through the silence like a bell. Loretta Robinson stepped forward, her hands trembling, tears already streaking down her cheeks. "Oh, my sweet baby," she whispered. Kayla didn't move at first. Her mind couldn't catch up to what her eyes were seeing. She'd stopped believing anyone was coming for her a long time ago. But then Loretta opened her arms, and something inside Kayla cracked wide open. The wall she'd built to survive. The silence she'd worn like armor. She slid off the witness stand, her feet barely touching the floor before she ran straight into her grandmother's arms. The sobs that broke from Kayla's chest weren't soft. They were ragged, the sound of years of fear and silence ripping their way out all at once. Loretta held her so tight it was like she was afraid someone would try to steal her again. "I never stopped looking," Loretta whispered into her hair. "Not one day. I never gave up on you." Kayla's fingers clutched the back of Loretta's dress, her thin frame trembling with the effort of holding herself together. Detective Marks stepped back, her throat tight, blinking rapidly. Angela Perry turned away, wiping her own tears on the sleeve of her jacket. Even Judge Ford's throat worked as he sat back down. But this wasn't over. "Detective," Ford said, forcing his voice to steady. "I want arrests. Whitaker. Nichols. Every hand that touched those files." Marks nodded sharply, already in motion. "And the children." Ford's voice softened slightly. Mark's expression darkened. "Two confirmed deceased, Teresa and Malik, both buried in shallow graves on the edge of the property." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Kayla's grip on Loretta tightened so hard her knuckles turned bone white. "What about Jordan?" Ford asked. Marks took a breath. "We haven't found him yet." "But," she hesitated, "we found his backpack in the crawl space under the basement. And his shoes." Loretta's hand smoothed over Kayla's hair, her touch gentle, but her eyes fierce. "I'll take her home now," she said softly. Judge Ford nodded. "We'll arrange emergency custody paperwork." "Not emergency," Loretta said firmly, her voice shaking but resolute. "Permanent. I'm not letting her go again." For the first time all day, Kayla lifted her head. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red, but her fingers never left her grandmother's dress. "You mean it," she whispered. Loretta's voice broke. "With my whole heart, baby." In that moment, after years of being no one's first choice, no one's priority, no one's forever, Kayla finally believed it. The monsters were real. Some of them wore suits, some wore badges, some sat in offices and stamped papers, making children disappear with the flick of a pen. But there were good people, too. And for the first time, the monsters weren't winning. As Loretta led Kayla out of the courtroom, Detective Marks followed, already on the phone with her team, making sure that this house of horrors would never swallow another child again. Kayla glanced back just once, at the empty witness stand, at the worn bench where the judge had sat, at the thick wooden doors still locked from the inside. The house remembered everything. But so did Kayla. And this time, she wouldn't forget.